Good morning or afternoon, everybody. Today we have Dr. Asa Tarber back on the channel. He received his PhD in economics from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. He currently teaches at Riverside Community College. He is also the author of Prison Labor in the U.S. and Economic Analysis. He also teaches meditation classes on YouTube. Highly recommend you check those out along with his other YouTube videos. And he is a proud communist. Thank you for coming back onto the channel, Dr. Bear.
Absolutely. Yeah, we had a great conversation last time and look forward to our discussion today.
Yeah, same. Yeah, so I wanted to have you back on the channel today to talk about, socialism with Chinese characteristics, which I guess, that is that a is that what Deng Xiaoping, is that a term he coined, or is that something that somebody
I
else
don't
kind
know
of
who
gave?
exactly coined it, but I
Okay.
definitely Deng popularized it. Um,
Okay.
and I think there's something that's important about that phrase, which is, um, there's no universal blueprint for
Yes.
socialism. Um, we're talking about a society that is organized around the needs and desires of the masses of people, and this is just a tremendous break with how societies have been organized in the modern era, right? They've been organized around the desires of the elite. Uh,
Mhm.
and so, like, of course, it has to be socialism with Chinese characteristics or socialism with Italian characteristics, like had that been in Italy or something.
Yep.
So I think that's a kind of underappreciated phrase, and sometimes that is just because of the sheer magnitude of the anti-socialist propaganda here. That phrase is trotted out as if to say, oh, this is not real socialism or something. And real socialism, I mean, the word for that in Marxism is idealism.
Yes.
There is no metaphysically pure category for us to point to, and if we create one, it's not going to be that useful.
Yeah. 100%. 100%. Yeah, I think a lot of people, especially in the Western left, seem to have this very idealized or kind of romanticized version of what socialism is, and just are very set on like this one definition. When you point out like what you just said in your lecture, like, no, you need to look at the material conditions in each society and work towards a version of socialism that works, in that context. And don't be, dogmatic about it, because like you said, what maybe works in China wouldn't work in Italy, wouldn't work in the US, wouldn't work in Mexico, etc., right?
Yeah, and I think the things that feel exciting, maybe to like the Western Marxist, don't China. Well, a lot of what China does doesn't read that way. Like you don't think like Marxism and then like create the world's biggest dam or something like that, right? Like
Yeah.
that doesn't exactly track. That sounds like such a you know just if you just look at the project itself, it sounds just like, oh, that's just another IMF project or
Yep.
something. I mean, even though like China doesn't fund on that basis, which of course gives them much more freedom. They're not shackled to the IMF or World Bank dictates. Um, but what they actually do, industrialize, right? If I mean that's what they spent decades industrializing. So, and that doesn't strike us in the West maybe as that exciting because we're coming from industrialized societies already, and
Hmm.
it's hard to see like how vital that is for a country that is largely rural, largely agricultural at the time of the revolution, and industrialization is absolutely their pressing need. And we it's like I see this a lot on social media and things. The people are like, oh, well, they haven't abolished the commodity form or something like this, right? And yeah, they haven't. I mean, like, it's a market-based society, but it does that make it capitalism, right? I mean, because markets have existed a long time
Yep.
in human history. Capitalism itself is very new, and so it's good to explore the difference. Like especially when people talk about the reforms, they're like, oh well, this is just, these are capitalistic reforms or whatever. Um, and it's very interesting when you look at how do how do these debates take place in China. Now, let me just admit from the outset here that I'm not great on that topic myself because I don't speak Chinese, and
Yeah.
so I don't paint myself as an insider here, but I do try to listen to what like what the debates are, as well as I can, follow it right through translation and so on. Um, and as far as I can tell, that is a vital way to proceed, right? I mean, it would
Hmm.
no doubt it would be better. I would know more if I was on the inside of the society, but that's not my situation. So
Yeah, and I mean, it seemed like overall people in China are actually very happy with the central government, with the Chinese Communist Party. I saw a Harvard
right.
poll from 2016. It was, I think, 95% of the respondents from the survey in China were either satisfied or highly satisfied with the central government in Beijing. Compare that to the United States. I just went on Pew Research's website and it was only a quarter of the U.S. Have a trust in the federal government here. So I think they're obviously doing something right if that huge swath of the population thinks they're, doing a good job and just that contradiction compared, to the US, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think like China has gone from a situation where they were very fragmented and very weak for nearly a century, right? So, like let's say 1850 to 1950, right? Like just to
Yeah.
use a rough period. Um, and I think that that the desire for a national unification of some sort, was very strong just because of like when you read this history and this literature, it's nothing but humiliation, loss of face, right? The once great power that is reduced to penury, basically, right? through
Yeah.
through through imperialism. And though they were not strictly speaking colonized, it's like, well, Britain got what they wanted out
Yeah.
of the arrangement. They parceled off the part of China that they wanted, and um, if the country had maybe been a little smaller and a little more developed, then maybe they would have conquered the whole thing, right? But like
Yeah.
a country that's difficult to just because of its size and geographical variety and so on, right? um, so that basically are victimized by imperialism, and then finally reach a point where they're able to actually do their own economic policy. And I think and that it's generated such incredible results for the average person. I think that gives the government a lot of support, and that's like hard for us to understand. It's hard
Hmm.
for us to understand, like, oh, here's a functioning government that actually tries its damnedest to
Yes.
do what they say. Every government says that they're, oh, we're for the average person, right? But
Hmm.
99% of the time, that's lies, right? So
Yep.
to see a government that is actually trying to do that, I mean, with all of the limitations that are placed on the modern state, they still have to be concerned with like other states, impinging on them in one way or another, right?
Hmm.
Um, and that puts a lot of limitations on what a country can do. Uh, but within the context of that, right, they are making enormous strides towards people's well-being.
Yeah, I mean, it just makes me think of how they've handled the COVID-19 pandemic. And I just looked it up. They have less than 5,000 people have died from COVID-19 there, while in the United States, it's almost 750,000. So I just think that really speaks to actually, no, they actually really are looking out for the well-being of the people of the working class there as much as they can. And, trying to work through their, contradictions, like um, with the common what is it, the common prosperity plan that they just recently laid out a few months ago. Could you maybe talk a little bit about that? Because from my perspective, it seems like they're just continuing to try to work out their internal contradictions to work towards, communism, right?
Yeah, I mean, um, I think they properly recognize that communism is a very long-term aspiration, you know, and I think that's good to have a long-term aspiration, and it's also good to recognize that it's so different from existing modern societies that, um, like, okay, so if there's no blueprint for socialism, there's really no blueprint for communism, right?
Yeah.
Because we are venturing into the unknown there.
Mhm.
And to say that there will be no classes, to say that work will be so revolutionized that we won't even regard it as work,
Yeah.
that there won't be money or trade, that everything will be organized on the basis of need. I mean, these are like high concept things, right? And
Yeah.
so it's easy to look at a society and be like, well, that's not communist, like, and Marxists say this all the time, right? And it's true, right? It does not fit with the kind of grand dream of communism, but it's not good enough to be in a kind of black and white world over it, right? You have to be like,
Mhm.
well, what constitutes progress? What
Yes.
does it look like to
Mhm.
make a step forward toward
Mhm.
this unknown dream of how society might be? And the CPC has always struck me as being very pragmatic, and
Mhm.
saying, well, what can we do that the majority of our party members support, that would improve people's material lives, right, in some way. um, and they've had a lot to do on just on that level, and then also making this kind of risky bargain with the rest of the world, right? This takes us into the reform period of Deng, and knowing that they're setting out to be the world's low cost manufacturing center,
Mhm.
um, with all of the contradictions, and that's a bargain with global capitalism right there,
Yeah.
saying like, hey, you need like a low wage country to that's friendly to capital, that you can go and produce, uh, save money, right, outsource all of that, right. So it's like the CPC correctly analyzes the way that global trade is going, right, and takes a seat at that table, knowing that it's a shitty seat, right, but
Mhm.
also that they can get something from it, which is
Mhm.
they can learn, they can learn through the the export of capital to China, right. They can learn introductory manufacturing, right, like the kind of textile level, right, that's not advanced manufacturing. It's basic manufacturing. But if you can get a handle on that, then you can move up towards
Mhm.
mid-range, manufactured goods, right? And this now most countries are prevented from doing this for one reason or another, right?
Yeah.
Because their economic policy gets taken out of their hands.
Yep.
It ends up being in the hands of the IMF, let's say, right? If they take IMF loans, and so China was also wise to never do that, right? And to never relinquish control over their economic policy to others. But they were also aware that it's going to cause contradictions socially, culturally, and economically, and that some are going to get rich out of this, right? And
Mhm.
that there's going to be an emerging capitalist class. Um, Now, talk about a contradiction, right? So they have to, in order to do this grand bargain, right? They have to support the creation or the recreation of the capitalist class in some fashion. And so then the question becomes, how do you keep them from gaining control over the society, right?
Mhm.
And effectively pulling a counter revolution.
Yeah.
Um, and so that I feel like that's been one of their central dilemmas, since the reforms of 1978, and it's escalated. Its contradictions have escalated since then because, of course, they have a lot of symbols of capital. They have a stock market, for example, right?
Yeah.
They have billionaires. They have a retail sector. They have all of the things that we think of as being the appearance of capitalism. But then you look at, they have billionaires, right? This is the thing you often hear on Twitter. Um, and then you look at that and you're like, well, it requires you to have a little more detail, right? Like, well, do these capitalist firms, because there certainly are private capitalist firms in China, right?
Yep.
These private capitalist firms, would you say that they run the government or that the government runs them? I mean, just to
Mhm.
make it very simple, right? I mean, like things are always more complicated than this,
Yeah.
but in the United States, I think you would have to conclude that the large capitalist firms absolutely run the government. I mean, like
Yeah.
what they want, they get. Like that they don't get everything because, of course, there are conflicts between different branches of capitalism, right? So, like there's conflicts between the retail sector and manufacturing sector, for example, or between the finance sector and the retail sector, or between landlords and productive capitalists. So these are well-known divisions, and they might one particular corporation might not get its way because other corporations are against it or whatever, right? So, but if you look at it in China, what you find is the state absolutely dictates even to the largest of these capitalist firms, right? These companies have a phone in them, right? And that phone is like a set line, right? It comes from the government. Like when that phone rings, you answer it and you do whatever they say to do. I mean,
Yeah.
that is very different, right? I mean, like,
Yeah.
what do you call that? So this is like what's happening in China, is just difficult for us definitionally, um, because, like I say, they clearly have private capital, but is private capital in charge? Do they have the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie?
Mhm.
The Marxist phrase, right?
Mhm.
I would say they don't, right?
Yeah.
But they do have the contradictions of enormous inequality, right? That's forming, right? Because they have the problem of the rural-urban divide, right? That every society has this to some extent, right? That every society that's industrialized, but China has, the state of development in rural China is just very, very different from this. Um, and so they're starting to address this, right? They're starting to say, well, we have made tremendous progress, right? They have successfully climbed the value ladder of manufacturing, right? And now produce, very advanced
Yeah.
manufacturing goods, right? Their growth in things like electronics, right? Like China has become a top electronics manufacturer, right? So
Mhm.
talking about something that's very high value, very
Mhm.
difficult to produce, um, and robotics, right? Like China is like one of the world's largest importers of robotics, right? So they are very determined to continue and be in the most advanced manufacturing that they can be in. Um, but since they've had so much success there, right now they're turning their attention towards how can we reduce the level of inequality, and this will be very interesting to see how this plays out, right? Because um, the way, just judging from the history that we've seen, right? Um, the way that they might go about that is no doubt going to be very different from what we've seen other societies do.
Mhm.
So it'd be interesting to see what happens.
Yeah, I think that's a really important distinction that you bring up, that yes, they do have private capital, they do have capitalism in China, they do have, billionaires, but they're not, running the country, they're not deciding, economic policy, they're not part of, central planning, as opposed to the United States, as you correctly pointed out. The very wealthy, the capitalist class, it's very much a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, and we see that through the policies that the US government passes, as opposed to, China. It's definitely the CPC, the Chinese Communist Party, is very much, in charge, and I think that is a very important distinction. So what do you think the rationale was for the reformist period that started under Deng Xiaoping? Was it just wanting to rapidly increase the rate of industrialization? I know you also brought up here and then in your lecture of wanting to kind of move up the value chain, and it seems like they've done a really good job of doing that. And so maybe the thought at the time that this increased industrialization wasn't happening enough under the Maoist period, so they wanted to open up and privatize certain sectors of the economy. But in your lecture, you also pointed out that the kind of the commanding heights of the economy, these very important industries, whether it's telecommunications or the weapons industry, etc., are still largely controlled by the state, right?
Yeah, right. I mean, we don't want to overlook the importance of the state-owned sector, right? State-owned sector is large in China, and they've been very careful, as you say, about what industries they allow to be private and which ones they don't, because key industries, right, or this commanding heights idea is they want to retain control over the economy, certainly, right, even while they allow private capital certain inroads. Um, and like what I think it's worth looking at, like what did they gain through that, right? Or what happened, like if we contrast the economic development of the Maoist era to the post Deng kind of era. Um, when I look at what they're doing in manufacturing, under Mao, it's real basic level manufacturing, right? They are trying to get a handle on the kind of the fundamentals, the like the you know, lumber, steel, coal, concrete, this kind of stuff, right? These are foundations of industrialization because, like what industrial products do not require steel, I mean, like it's
Yeah.
you need a functioning steel industry, and so they poured resources into that, and there's some colorful stories from the Maoist era about, these backyard furnaces and stuff like this. And I think it just kind of shows, and some of this stuff worked and some of it didn't, right? But it shows the kind of, um, experimental thinking, right? They're like, how can we industrialize as quickly as possible, right?
Hmm.
Um, and to me, it's odd, like when I see like my economist colleagues, talking about, China under Mao or something like this, and saying like, oh, the Great Leap Forward is an utter disaster economically, or something like this, or
Yeah.
the Cultural Revolution, what a disaster. And it's like, again, this is a society which is under an extremely rapid change, right, in every single level, right? Like
Mhm.
just just the unification that's new, right? Moving from this, warlord period where there's, no central economic policy, to then the massive invasion of the Japanese and all of the difficulty, the 20-year long struggle between, the Kuomintang and this People's Army and so on. Um, so, just being unified for the first time, is an enormous change. But then also having a government which is just utterly focused on rapid industrialization, um, and basically succeeds. Like so, I think that this is not well known enough. Like when we look at the Maoist period, that this is the period of the most rapid economic
Mhm.
development in the entire history of China up to that point, right?
Yeah.
So are there hiccups and whatever? Are there periods where there might be a contraction or something? Yeah, of course. I mean, there's a huge famine during this time, right? So, there are contractions, but these contractions are taking place in the context of, like I said, absolutely the most stunning economic development that China's ever seen. Um,
Mhm.
so it's like people blithely say these things like, "Oh, the Great Leap Forward devastated the economy." Like, really, like the economy doubled in size of in a few years, right? And then
Yeah.
experienced contraction. Like under Mao, I throw this figure out all the time on Twitter. That the total amount of economic growth in that 30 years is 600%.
Mhm.
There's absolutely no parallel for that, and that's very good for any nation, right? I mean, so to say that Mao didn't understand economics or something, or that socialism or communism, can never produce rapid economic development, I think really flies in the face of the actual history there. Um, Now, some people will say China went from being very poor to slightly less poor, and that's true. But again, 600% economic growth is a significant amount of growth, right? Like you have
Yeah.
to start somewhere. You don't get to just wave a magic wand and like, okay, now we're socialist and rich. That's not how it works.
Yeah.
Like you have to build on what came before, and what they had to build on was, the ruins of decades of fighting, right? So, um, in that, and like again, they did some experimental stuff, right? I mean, like Mao is very interested in casting off the superstition and backwardness, as he called it, right, of the past. Um, and like I said, this is an experiment, right? Trying to make these changes this rapidly. But there's also the issue of counter revolution, right?
Mhm.
And does the society, do the bourgeois elements of the society, gain strength, or are they attenuated?
Mhm.
Um, and so that's an important thing to look at too. But when you look at like where did their industrialization end up at the end of Mao, they're still at a very basic level, right? So it um, they do manage to kind of create those fundamentals in the industries that I mentioned. Um, but this is certainly not enough to like seal the country off from trade and abolish the commodity form or whatever else, right? Like,
Yeah.
the country is still, if we get into the 1970s in China, the country is still extremely poor on a per capita basis, right? So, um, they've only just kind of begun, which makes sense because it'd only been a few decades at that point, right, since the revolution. Um, so I think that the reforms of Deng, were necessary, very much so. I don't know if that makes me a Dengist or whatever. I don't recognize that term exactly, but
Yeah.
um, I think it's about what suits the needs of the country, and the people as a whole. Not trying to split hairs ideologically or whatever.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a point well taken, and yeah, really interesting about the great leap forward and how critics of Mao or that period of China in general were like to claim that he was responsible for millions or like 16.5 million deaths or something like that. When in your lecture you rightly pointed out that famines have had a long history in Chinese history, and more likely than not, these measures that Mao and the CPC enacted, actually saved millions of lives, and there was this confluence of factors during that great leap forward, and there was a drought, there was flooding, there was and it's like you said, it's an experiment. They were trying to figure out what would meet the needs of the population at the time, and trying these different things like the compulsory grain purchases where the numbers may have been inflated a little bit, so they ended up exporting some of the grain. But I think, yeah, to definitely take a more nuanced approach and actually look at what was happening, which is what a good Marxist should do, right? And analyze the material conditions of what was happening and be objective
Right.
about it. Um, yeah, and then also, the Great Leap Forward also had, kind of a, social or cultural aspect to it. They, allowed women to get, to divorce from their, husband. They banned foot binding. I think they also allowed women to own property, all things that, weren't possible before those reforms took place. And it just seems like China is continuing to look at the material conditions, trying to work through the contradictions that are still present. But this just seems like so many people claim to be on the left, who even claim to be socialists, like to throw so much hate and vitriol towards what they're doing, and just acting very anti-Marx in their analysis. And I just find that very, very troubling, frankly, because they're trying to do the best with the material conditions that they have. And again, there's a reason why so many people in China are highly satisfied or very satisfied with the central government there, right?
Yeah, I think that's true. And if we're going to talk about the contentious issue of famine, I think that's definitely, that comes up here. This is one of the things that has been so hammered, in terms of like this, you know anti-communist propaganda. um, the narrative has been spun that millions died in the Great North China Famine, and this is all the fault of Mao. It's all the fault of socialism. Like, this is just as wrong as could possibly be. I mean, like, if you want to get into like, well, what causes famine? Like, famine is a huge problem historically, right? And it's a class-based problem, right? So,
Yeah.
if you were particularly, like, if you're anti-Marxist, I understand you don't want to use the concept of class, right? But if you're a Marxist, you probably should use it, right? And so, like, well, what are the class roots of famine? And when we explore that, what we find is, well, in many or most parts of the world, you have something like feudalism, right? Or you have a landlord or sharecropping kind of class, right? You have an owner class that, because of their ownership of the land, is able to extract large rents in various forms, right? So like in medieval Europe, you had the corvée system, right? And so rent was initially paid in the form of labor, right? So you had, days where the serfs would be able to work on their own tenure, right? The plot of land which was theirs by traditional kind of right, though it was not owned by them because only nobles could own land. But they so their time was split between the lord's domain and
Hmm.
their own tenure where they would be able to eat the crops that they grew, right?
Yeah.
But that split was about 50% or so of their time was spent producing for another, right? um, in China you didn't have that same arrangement. You had a landlord class. The landlord class is a little bit larger as a percentage, but it's still a very small group, uh, and is extracting rents of similar magnitude, right, of say 50, maybe
50 to
70
70.
percent
Yep.
um, Now this places the great mass of the agricultural populace at tremendous risk, right? So because if anything goes wrong, then they starve. I mean, like,
Hmm.
how easy is it to make a living from the land when you spend half or a third of your available time on making a living from it, right? I mean, like, that places you in tremendous danger. And we have a situation where millions of people are placed in this danger, right? And so what happens, and like, I feel very confident saying that this is risky because you look at the actual history of famine and you're like, wow, famines occur with stunning regularity
Hmm.
in the history of China, and they are devastating, right? I mean, and millions of people die. And so when you look at the now, let me say something about the measurement of these deaths. When you have a underdeveloped, sprawling country like China that doesn't have a real strong central government, even under the Qing dynasty, like, looking back historically, what we see is, you see the power is held by local governors and provinces in China, more or less, right? And then there's well, so the central state has a lot less power than we think, because we're sort of, when we look at history, right, you always look at history from your own perspective, right? And we look
Yeah.
at it from the perspective of a pretty strong central government like that we have in the United States, right? Um, that's just not the situation in China. Before the revolution, it's more the situation now, but even now, you have a lot of sharing of power with on the provincial level. Um, so to say that this is somehow the fault of the central government or the head of state of the central government, you're already making an error there, right? Um, but the problem is this maldistribution of land and resources. That is the thing that sets a society up, that creates the ideal conditions for big famines. And that's the first thing that China attacked and sought to
Hmm.
change, right? This incredibly unfair system, right? The system that doomed large numbers of people to working their whole lives for somebody else, right? And when we add in the fact that a lot of these local landlords were also money lenders, right? That makes the situation far worse. The extraction of surplus, from, they're not, strictly speaking, they're not serfs, but from the rural tenancy, is just at a super high level. Um, and to Mao and the Communist Party, right, as they go through a long march and gain the support of the peasantry, I think
Hmm.
they observe the situation, right? They see what agriculture is like, by spending time in the countryside, and they say this is top priority, and they change that. It's the largest land reform in history, apart from what the Soviets did, right? So it's, well, maybe it's even larger because the Chinese population is larger. But anyway, these are big moves, right? These are
Yeah.
big changes, and they're hard changes to make because the society has been used to this kind of thing for 1,000 years or more, right? In China, um, probably more than that actually, but um, so it all goes together, right? Trying to reform the tremendous maldistribution of land, and also trying to improve productivity. The difference between the Soviet situation and China, is that land in China is already highly cultivated. It's been cultivated for a long time.
Yeah.
They don't have a lot of uncultivated land that they can sort of take advantage of. They have to move towards greater efficiency. Um, and some of this involves just pure economies of scale, right? Like, you
Hmm.
know, farming larger plots, using more capital. You have a tremendous capital problem, like when agriculture is organized on the basis of these small plots.
Yeah.
It's very hard for these tenant farmers to invest in capital, and where's the incentive? Where's anybody's incentive? Like, the landlord or money lender, are they helping these tenant farmers invest in, even just the simplest kinds of things like a plow, or farm animals, right?
Mhm.
This is the basic level of investment. And there's a tremendous blockage there, right? So what you see is very low capitalization in agriculture, and then very low productivity, and these are the things that create the conditions for famine. um, and that is just very, very poorly understood. I mean, people step to me all the time and are like, well, socialism creates famine. It's like, I'm afraid the exact opposite of that is true, right?
Yeah.
Socialism has eliminated famine from societies in which famine was a huge problem for a millennia. um, that is a absolutely monumental human achievement, and yet we are told the exact opposite.
Hmm.
Um, and it's just not, it's just very poor quality thinking that leads you to that conclusion, that it's a mix of idealism and, senseless blame for central authorities. And, um, Mao, certainly, there's no evidence anywhere in Mao's writings, in anything that he ever said, right, that
Hmm.
he ever wanted a famine of any sort anywhere in China, right? Um, Not so, it's not a plan. Well,
Yeah.
was it something that happened through neglect? Well, they're balancing two very difficult forces here, right? The tremendous scale of reforms, and the need to industrialize, right? So
Hmm.
in order to gain the raw materials and the technology, the actual capital, right, the machinery that they need, they have to export something, because, like, the capital goods are not produced in China, right? They're still at a very basic level of industrialization. They have to import that from somewhere, and then they have
Yeah.
to give something in exchange, right? So what do they have to give in exchange? Well, part of what they have is agricultural output, Um, and so, they do export food, right? And then they end up getting kind of caught in the horns of a dilemma, right? Which is that, they have this flooding, they have this drought, they have weather conditions, which lead to a reduction in output. But because of the decentralization, it's very hard to get accurate figures on what is actually happening, right? Um, uh, and there's incentives at play here, right? Where
Hmm.
sometimes, people want to hide output, or they want to look good, they want to over declare things, they want to make it seem like they're hitting targets, right? Um, and so this, when you look at what happened in retrospect, what you see is, that they're continuing to export grain even during a famine, and then people say, oh, there's the smoking gun, like they were exporting, and so they don't care that millions die, whatever. They don't know what's happening, right? Like, as soon as they find this out, they make changes. Um, so we have, like, it's a kind of a lack of clear thinking, even among my colleagues who really should know better, when it comes to this.
Yeah, and I mean, it makes sense that they were, during the Maoist period, they had that first wave of collectivization because they were wanting to increase those economies of scale, as you pointed out, and also increase, agricultural production for, a number of reasons, both to make sure the populace was being fed, as well as because their, rate of industrialization was so, kind of backwards at the time. They needed to export something in order to get, capital in return to, develop their, industries. And then, yeah, like the Great Leap Forward, that was the, second period of collectivization during the Maoist period, and that was because the, rates of industrialization or agricultural production wasn't increasing enough, right? So they had to kind of go back to the drawing board. It's like, well, this wasn't really working as much as we like, so we need to institute these new new policies, and it maybe didn't work as well as they would have liked, but definitely wasn't some sinister plot by Mao or the CPC to have to increase suffering or anything in the country. And yeah, it's just very ahistorical, not looking at the material conditions to suggest otherwise. But yeah, a lot of people just have that capitalist propaganda, as somebody said in the comments, just deeply ingrained into their thinking. It's just, yeah, very problematic when people have that view and are just so dogmatic and subjective about things. But there's so many people out there like that, and it seems like a lot of them just have this anti-China rhetoric deeply embedded into their thinking for whatever reason. And I mean, there's just so many from your lecture. I mean, during the Maoist period, life expectancy in China grew from 35 to 65, so it almost doubled. I mean, that's incredible. Infant mortality rates fell. Population grew by 77%. Obviously, that's in part due to lower infant mortality rates. Crop yield per hectare increased by 45.9%. Total food production by almost 70%. And as you said in the lecture, I mean, that's hard to hard to reckon those facts with millions of people dying from a famine, right? And the real GDP from 52 to 60 nearly doubles in the country. And then so all the people talking about millions of people died during the Great Leap Forward, like actually you're not really looking at what actually happened in China at the time, and how under the Chinese Communist Party, like so many great things happen, so many these different metrics improve greatly for the working people there. And I feel like that needs to be celebrated and pointed out, right?
Yeah, I mean, we want to acknowledge that there was a
Yeah.
famine, and that famine caused a lot of suffering, and that's very sad, right? I mean, but to move immediately from that fact to some kind of overblown and overly simplistic blame, particularly towards an idealized notion of what is socialism,
Yes. Yes.
is just indefensible. And you see people who are competent thinkers, and usually logical, and then they'll say some stuff like that, where you're like, that is a complete departure from the rest of your argument, which was very careful. But one of the things that is at issue here too is you see these like enormous figures being mentioned when it comes to the death toll. 100 million deaths and stuff like this, right? I mean, these are lies, unfortunately. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of this. I addressed it somewhat in the lecture, just that people. The problem is that no one has a figure for this. The central government doesn't have a figure. We don't have good figures for famine deaths in China beyond a certain point, and that point actually, I mean, China did eliminate famine, so we don't have, if we had one now, no doubt we'd have very good data on it, right?
Yeah.
Because we're in a much different situation in
Yeah.
2021 than they were in 1961, right? So, or in 1861, right? I mean, because there's famines all the way through here, and we don't have a good death toll for literally any of them, right? And so, estimates are the only thing that we have. We know that millions of people died in the Great North China Famine. Like I said, that's very sad. Um, but some of these estimates are based on just completely questionable kind of premises, right? Which is they will take, and this is a kind of common thing, right? To take a birth rate, say before and after, and say, oh well, look at this, the birth rate fell, and if it hadn't fallen, there'd be millions more people alive, right?
Yeah.
So you're like, okay, well, you're mixing in actual deaths with notional deaths, like
Hmm.
if someone isn't born, are you going to say that they died? I mean, like that makes very little sense. But unfortunately, this is incredibly common, like
Yeah.
these kinds of projections. And they are, I mean, I'm not against this kind of data, looking at demographics and stuff, but you just have to be careful with it. And you don't mix that in with actual deaths, like,
Hmm.
and there's also the problem of like the base year, right? Like, are you choosing the base year based on some like objective criteria, or are you
Mhm.
choosing it because you by choosing a base year with a high birth rate and then comparing it to another year with a low birth rate? Well, this is where you get these like tens of millions of missing people type of analyses, right?
Yeah.
That is a very, very sensitive to the choice of the base year. I don't know if this is getting too technical for your viewers. I'm not sure, but like, the point is, right? There's a lot of ways to
Yeah,
massage these numbers,
sure.
and they have been massaged, and we need to look at that and we need to analyze them carefully, and not just accept them at face value,
Sure.
and certainly not then go from there to like, oh well, Mao meant for this to happen, and
Yeah.
like I think
Yeah.
there's just no evidence of that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's probably some of these inflated numbers are coming from, think tanks like the Victims of Communism Fund or something like that, right? And
Oh, right, yeah,
definitely,
yeah,
definitely having that nuanced approach. Like, yes, there was suffering, there was a famine. Like, that's horrible. But like looking at these numbers that may have been, inflated. How are they counting them? As you're pointing out, is super important, and definitely wasn't some type of sinister effort by Mao or the Chinese Communist Party at the time to starve these people.
right.
Obviously, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the fundamental class process in agriculture, what that was like under Mao, and then what that's like after the kind of reform period took place in China.
Yeah. So it's an interesting question. Like, so Marxism, of course, looks at uses the concept of surplus value, surplus labor as a key concept, right? And this is what forms the difference between necessary and surplus. And then the big questions are, who takes and appropriates the surplus? What do they do with it?
Yeah,
How does that then shape society? How is it shaped by other social and economic factors? Um, and we want to use dialectical reasoning here, right? To not assume that any particular force in society has utter primacy, right? Like
hmm,
is the primary driver of whatever, right? Because to say that anything is the primary driver sets that up as like the kind of key to understanding society, and societies are complex, they're unpredictable. Like if there was a key, well, we could use that to be able to predict and control society, but that doesn't seem to be the case, right? I mean, like
yeah,
societies are not easy to predict, like
hmm,
based on whatever analytical tool you use. And why is that? Maybe it's because there's a zillion multifaceted, interconnected factors, right? And so we need to proceed on that basis. We need to proceed with a bit of humility and say,
sure,
the fact that all of these variables and forces exist and that they're so interconnected, right? We can get a sense of the interplay, but we have to always be alert to what we say is cause might be effect, right? And vice
yeah,
versa. So,
yeah,
to me, this is like the dialectical materialism that Marxism has long avowed. But sometimes, it's very easy to depart from that, right? Because we always want simple, clear answers,
yeah,
even when they don't necessarily exist.
yeah,
Um, so when it's a lengthy preamble there, but when we look at like what are the class change in the class structure. So class structure is like we have a certain kind of production and appropriation of surplus that is going on in a certain sector. Usually there's a variety of different forms, right? So, but what we see in agriculture is largely farmers working either individually or in a family unit. On generally speaking, on a pretty small plot. There are variations of that. There are larger farms. There is even wage labor. And so that's not the only. So we would characterize that as a mixture of independent commodity production, right? That's the individual producer producing for market. Um, and small capitalist production, right, where people are working for a wage, and then the capitalist takes the product and sells it. Um, and that's prevalent in agriculture in China. The capitalist part of that tends to be pretty small. It's emerging, and so at the time of the revolution, um, this is how the class structure of agriculture is organized. So the major change that they do right away is they say this parasitical landlord class, we are just going to eliminate that. Now, there's a lot of confusion around this too, right? Because people say, "Oh, well, that's classicide." No, it's not, right? Because they're not saying any landlord we're going to kill them. They're saying you're just not going to be a landlord anymore.
Yeah.
We're eliminating that as a structure of the economy. We're not going to allow people to, live off the labor of others in this way, right? That's just not something that we are going to allow, and then they don't, right? Now, some of these landlords were tremendously abusive, right? And they aroused an enormous amount of anger from their tenants, and so some of them were killed, right? By and large, they were killed by, those that knew them. Like this
Yeah.
was not a case of the central government coming in and
Hmm.
saying, line them up, we're going to kill you.
Yeah.
This is a case of, peasant farmers who had never been given much of a voice in their society ever, right? Um, Now for the first time are being listened to, right? Um, and saying, well, what are the crimes here? I mean, and there are a lot of crimes, right? When you take that proportion of people's labor, um,
Mm.
people are going to die as a result, right?
Yeah.
And that's of course what happened. I mean, like you look at read any book that features rural Chinese agriculture, and you're going to find some horrible stories in that, right? About, children who died because they could not afford food, medicine, right? Why can't they afford those things? Does it have anything to do with the 50 to 70% of the output of labor that's being taken from these farmers? Like, I bet it does, right?
Yeah.
Um, so there was a lot of very strong anger on the part of the peasantry, toward this landlord class. Um, and what we see is that oftentimes the central government wanted to try to pull it back, right? And say,
Mhm.
don't,
Yeah.
they weren't always effective at being able to do that.
Yeah.
So that's one thing, right? But the first level of change was just the abolition of the landlord class. But then you haven't really changed the structure of agriculture all that much in terms of,
Mhm.
like this issue about capitalization and economies of scale has
Yep.
not been addressed by that, right? All you've done is remove the parasitic relationship. Now that's an important step, right? And perhaps if you allowed things to develop organically at that point, the independent commodity producers would be better off. Some of them would buy more land, perhaps, right? And you would probably see the development of capitalism in agriculture in a similar fashion as it's happening in the United States, right? The United States also has small family farms for part of its history, right? Like the history of like settlement. Um, and then, the smaller farms give way to the larger farms. And so now what we have are, you know, large scale capitalist firms dominate agriculture in the United States, right? So, you go from the individual commodity producer to the capitalist corporation. That's been the path of development of agriculture in the US. Uh, Now, China wanted to go a different way, right? They wanted to not produce that kind of inequalities, not produce a bourgeois class in agriculture. Um, so they're doing that differently, but they want the economies of scale. They want the cooperation. They want the specialization and
Mhm.
division of labor that Adam Smith talks about as being key to productivity, right, in the
Yeah.
development of capitalism. They want that in agriculture. And so they always had this plan, right? Mao always had this plan. Like getting rid of the landlords is only the first step, right? We need to collectivize, and for some reason Mao thought that large scale farms was the way to go, and that the Soviets, they had like a kind of discussions about what should the scale be for these agricultural collectives. Um, and they had some interesting thought about this. Some of these institutions are still around, actually. They did produce these very large scale agricultural enterprises where they're sort of like towns or cities,
Mhm.
in the
Yeah.
countryside.
Yeah.
And that's interesting, right? Because then they are able to produce some of these economies of scale, and no doubt this is what led to the increase in output. It also changes the class structure, right? Because when you have that, you shift away from independent commodity production, and then the question is towards what, right? So you had a
Mhm.
very interesting structure in these agricultural collectives, um, where for the first time the farmers were guaranteed certain things, right? They had this, and
Yep.
they call this the Iron Rice Bowl. This is interesting, right? Being
Mhm.
guaranteed a certain level of consumption, being guaranteed, a certain level of, say, medical care. Now this was difficult to deliver in China, right? So, but being having any kind of access to this, right? Having access to education, having this is just very very new. It was immensely popular, and yet it also had consequences, right? They partly they did this, to boost productivity, but they also did it to try to deal with another problem, which was they know that they have tremendous divisions between the countryside and the cities. And what happens when a country industrializes? Industrialization tends to occur around cities, and so
Hmm.
people move to cities because there's more economic activity. There's it's more likely for you to have a higher income in cities, right? I mean, like this is known, right? Like
Yeah.
that happens in the United States as well, right? That happens in advanced countries. They didn't want that to happen too quickly. By the way, it's already happened. They tried to slow it, right? The rural to urban migration in China is probably the largest that's ever occurred anywhere.
Yeah.
It has had. There's no way to stop it, but they hope to just slow it.
Hmm.
And so one of the things that they did is they bound people to their agricultural collectives, to and they've called them various things, right, over the years. Um, and so we could kind of analyze that as sort of benign form of the feudal fundamental class process, right? Where because we have to ask the question: is there like a capitalist labor market? Like, are people free to sell their labor power to whoever they want? Um, and the answer during that period is no, right? I mean, like they
Hmm.
have a passport system, they control migration, um, and they also give out substantial welfare. So, I always feel like a little bit divided about using the term feudal, because we don't
Yeah.
think of feudal and welfare as going hand
Yeah.
in hand. But I'm just using it to kind of counterpose it to say, well, look, it's clearly not capitalism, right? Like capitalism has to have a free labor market of some sort, and we just don't see that in agriculture at this time, right? So,
Hmm.
you know, um, it's an interesting form of modern feudal production, which seems to be pretty benign, um, and is important at this particular phase of China's development. But then it gives way to something else, right? They get rid of the iron rice bowl. Um, they create a labor market, which they see as necessary for their next phase of industrialization. There does need to be some rural to urban migration in order for there to be a industrial labor force. Um, and so they once they've made these changes, well, but then it causes other problems, right? Because if you have a labor market, then there are going to be some people who don't do well in that labor market, right? Um, and so that problem of inequality, right? That problem of like, well, what do you do about that cohort of people that just is not successful for whatever reason, right? Is not successful in the labor market, um, or is experiencing exploitation, right? Like when you look at like what's happening in China's factories, you get a kind of vision of like early capitalism, long hours,
Hmm.
injuries.
Yeah.
It's a picture of exploitation, right? And so that's like difficult to square with like socialism or Marxism, right? Marxism is against exploitation.
Yeah.
Someone should not get rich off the labor of others. So there's a host of contradictions here, um, and it's easy, it's tempting to want to flee from those contradictions and say
Hmm.
like, oh well, this is not socialism or whatever, right? Like as if socialism is a situation where there are no contradictions.
Yeah.
Um, I don't see that as Marxism personally. Like I think contradiction is a central concept. Contradiction exists in every society,
Mm.
and why would that be different after they have a revolution? They're able to make a lot of progress, right? I mean, so doing the kind of land reforms that Mao did, even in the very first years, that's amazing, right? And most societies are not able to do that. They talk about doing land reform, everyone recognizes it's necessary, but powerful interests block it. I mean, that's the story of like African country after African country, right? They have a maldistribution of land because of the legacy of imperialism.
Yes.
Um, are they able to do those kind of land reforms? Mostly the answer is no. That maldistribution continues, and people suffer as a result because they don't have the power to change it, right? They haven't had a revolution, right? Or maybe they've had a revolution, but it's been a decolonial revolution rather than a socialist revolution, right? Um, so to be able to successfully navigate these huge changes, that's something that we should just kind of appreciate, right? Does it mean
Yeah,
the contradictions will go away?
sure.
No, it doesn't.
Yeah, and like you said, I mean, just because there was a socialist revolution in that country doesn't mean that that automatically that's going to be some type of socialist, utopia is created. Those contradictions are still going to be present, and that's something that China is still continuing to work on internally, right? And they're not shying away from that with what
Right.
we see with the common path to prosperity. Um, no, we've reached our time here again. Really appreciate your insight and analysis. I learned, so much from watching your lectures and talking with you on here. And just wanted to, yeah, give you the floor. Where can people find you? And maybe if you have any book recommendations for people to learn more about, kind of China and, socialism with Chinese characteristics.
Yeah. Well, I would certainly recommend Xi Jinping's book, "The Governance of China,"
Okay.
Governance Modern China. That's excellent. There's yeah, there's a whole list of like
Sure.
of good books. Most of them, I think, come from China. Like
Okay.
we have a kind of there's a poor record of Western analysts. I'm not going to say none of them are good, but there's a lot of bad ones out there. Uh, but yeah, people are interested in finding me. You can look me up on YouTube. I'm active on Twitter. Um, I put out threads on these topics and lectures and things like that. I have a Patreon page if people want to support me. You can find me there as well. But thanks so much for having me on the program. I always enjoy our conversations and look forward to talking to you further.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks again.
All right.